October 12, 1946, Camp Hearn, Texas. This photograph was taken at 9:14 a.m. by Army Signal Corps photographer Clara Whitmore, just minutes before a transport truck carried the last group of German POWs away from the camp forever. But look at the boy in the frame. Who was he? Why was a German prisoner, an enemy soldier, crying in the arms of an American widow's kindness? And why was he clutching a small wooden horse as if it were the last piece of his soul? Behind him stands a barn he rebuilt with his own hands. Behind her is the memory of the husband she lost in the war he fought. So what happened here? What story hides behind this single frozen tear, this rebuilt barn, this impossible moment between former enemies? And why did this young POW break down on the very morning he was supposed to go home? To understand this photograph, you have to go back to the day the barn burned, and to the stranger who rebuilt more than wood and nails. June 22, 1944, Brazos County, Texas. The sun had barely risen when the smoke trail became visible over the wheat fields, a thin, gray column twisting upward from the Turner farm like a plea to heaven. By the time the neighbors arrived, the barn was gone. Not damaged, not wounded. Gone. A blackened skeleton crouched on the red Texas dirt, still steaming in the early morning heat, smelling of burned timber, scorched hay, and the faint metallic scent of wet nails cooling in ash. Emily Turner stood barefoot in the yard, her nightgown streaked with soot, her face blank as stone. She did not cry. There were no tears left in her after the telegram from the War Department came 2 months earlier, informing her that her husband, Staff Sergeant Matthew Turner, had been killed during the push toward Monte Cassino. The barn had been his pride, his monument to a future he never lived to see. Now it lay in ruins, just like everything else he'd left behind. The neighbors whispered among themselves about the fire, about the widow, about the harvest she no longer had the manpower to save. But the strangest part wasn't the fire. Fires happened. Lightning struck, sparks traveled, accidents took no sides. The strangest part came an hour later, when a dust-covered U.S. Army transport truck rumbled down the dirt road and stopped in front of the dead barn. A guard jumped out first, adjusting his helmet. Then another. Then the back doors swung open. 12 German prisoners of war stepped into the Texas sunlight. Emily's breath caught in her throat. They were younger than she expected, some barely older than boys. Their uniforms were faded, some patched with makeshift stitching, others hanging loosely over thin shoulders. They blinked against the brightness like men preparing for execution. One flinched at the sight of a pitchfork leaning against a tree. Another looked at the burned barn and swallowed hard, as if he feared this destruction would be blamed on him. To Emily, it felt impossible. Enemy soldiers standing, on her land, on Matthew's land, on the soil an American soldier had died defending. And yet, here they were. The guard stepped forward, saluting stiffly. "Ma'am, we heard about the fire. Command authorized a work detail. These men will help clear the debris." Emily stared at him. "German soldiers. Here." "They're safe, ma'am, and they work hard." Her gaze shifted back to the POWs. One of them, tall, gaunt, with ash-blonde hair and eyes the color of worn denim, held his cap in both hands. He looked not dangerous, not fierce, but hollow, like someone who had eaten fear for breakfast too many mornings in a row. Emily's hands shook. Her husband had died fighting men like these, men in this same uniform, men who saluted the same flag. What were they doing here? But the Americans didn't seem alarmed. They didn't shout. They didn't shove the prisoners. They treated them like laborers, like hired hands. It felt wrong, unnatural. as if the war existed on one side of the ocean, and something else entirely lived here. The truck's engine clicked as it cooled. A vulture circled above. Beyond the fields, the distant rumble of a train carried the sound of freight cars filled with cotton and military supplies. America, even in wartime, was busy. And that was the truth beneath the surface of this moment. The truth no one said aloud. In 1944, the United States was fighting a two-front war, storming beaches in France and jungles in the Pacific, with more than 12 million American servicemen overseas. Every farm, every ranch, every factory back home struggled to stay alive. Labor was vanishing. The harvest was at risk. And so the government turned to the one resource it suddenly had in abundance: German prisoners of war. Nearly 400,000 Axis POWs lived behind American fences, and those fences were unlike anything the prisoners had been told to expect. Instead of starvation, they received 3,200 and 4,000 calories a day, the same as American troops. Instead of beatings, they were given medical care, libraries, Sunday church services. Instead of torture, they were assigned to farms, ranches, sawmills, paid in canteen coupons for their labor. Some received steaks, real steaks. Others were invited to Thanksgiving dinners. On ranches from Amarillo to Lubbock, cowboys taught German soldiers how to ride horses, how to mend fences, how to move cattle across open range. More than one POW wrote home insisting it must be propaganda. No enemy on earth could possibly be this generous. And yet, here in Texas, on this June morning, that generosity took on a strange new shape. Enemy soldiers, under guard, arriving to help rebuild the barn of an American widow. It felt impossible, but in wartime America, impossible things happened every day. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines at the pace of 3 per week. Factories built 96,000 aircraft a year. Women wielded rivet guns. High school boys drove tractors. The nation moved like a single, unstoppable machine. A machine powered not by cruelty but by abundance. Even now, the German prisoners glanced nervously at Emily as though awaiting condemnation. They looked at the burned barn, at the scorched remains of her hope, and then at the ground. At last, the tall blonde POW lifted his head. His voice was soft, heavy with an accent shaped by Bavarian hills and years of war. "We help," he said slowly, "if you wish." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. The thought tore through her like a lightning strike. Why would enemy soldiers want to help me? It made no sense. None. She should have felt hatred. She should have shouted at them to leave. She should have demanded that the army send someone else. Anyone else. Instead, she felt paralyzed. 12 enemy soldiers stood on her land, and not one of them looked like a killer. For a moment, time held still. The sun climbed. The burned barn smoldered, and the world waited to see what would happen next. Because nothing in the war, nothing in all the bloodshed overseas prepared her for the truth that was about to unfold. These men, these strangers in foreign uniforms, would do something Matthew himself never imagined. They would rebuild his barn, and in doing so, they would rebuild something inside themselves, something they thought the war had destroyed forever. The German prisoners had worked on American farms for nearly a year, yet the fear never truly left their bodies. It lived in their shoulders, in the way they kept their hands visible, in the way they glanced at every guard's rifle as if waiting for the moment it would rise. Even now, standing in the yard of the Turner farm beside the burned barn, the fear was a quiet, constant tremor under their skin. Oscar Muller felt it most sharply in his ribs. They tightened each time the American widow looked at him. Each time her eyes lingered a second too long on his uniform. He kept his posture straight, chin down, hands clasped behind his back the way the Wehrmacht had drilled into him. But the fear went deeper than discipline. It came from the stories he had been raised on, the warnings whispered in barracks from Normandy to Naples. Americans were savages, they had been told. Americans mutilated prisoners. Americans were mongrels, cowards who hid behind machines. Capture meant humiliation. Work meant starvation. Kindness was always a lie. The propaganda had been relentless. Radios crackled with warnings. Nazi officers had spoken of torture with the calm certainty of men describing tomorrow's weather. "Better to die than be taken," one sergeant had told Oscar 2 years earlier. "At least death is honorable. They will not give you that in America." And so, when Oscar had been captured outside St. Lo and shipped across the Atlantic, he had expected the worst. The Atlantic crossing itself had been a torment of imagination. He and the others lying awake beneath deck, picturing the moment. The hatch would open and the Americans would drag them out into hell. But hell never came. They were fed. They were given clothes. No one struck them. And that made it worse. Because fear fed on uncertainty far more than pain. At the Turner farm, Oscar kept his gaze low, but he could feel the eyes of the other prisoners flickering nervously around him. To them, the burned barn was a threat. If the Americans blamed them, even by mistake, there would be consequences. Punishment. Maybe worse. One of the older prisoners whispered in German, "If she thinks we burned it, we're dead." Another muttered, "Stay quiet. Don't provoke them." Yet the widow frightened them most. Emily stood with her arms crossed, jaw set, eyes tight with grief and suspicion. She wasn't loud or aggressive, but her silence felt sharper than a blade. She had every reason to fear them, and she did. To Emily, these men were not simply laborers. They were Germany. They were the uniforms Matthew had fought in Italy. They were the faces behind the rifles that had killed her husband. As the guards directed the prisoners toward the ruins of the barn, her stomach clenched with a reflex she couldn't control. What if they ran? What if they burned something else? What if they hurt her? She hated herself for thinking it. She had been raised better than prejudice. But war did not care about the lessons your parents taught you. War changed the way you looked at strangers. It taught you to measure danger first and humanity second. A young guard named Hayes hovered near the prisoners with a rifle slung across his chest. He was barely 20, his freckles still visible beneath the Texas sun, but his stance betrayed nervousness. He'd only been at this assignment for 3 months. Transferred from a replacement depot after a minor injury kept him stateside. His older brother was shipping out to the Pacific soon. And these prisoners, the enemy his brother would face overseas, now walked freely across the yard of a widow he was responsible for protecting. Hayes kept one hand on his rifle. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. It was the same fear the entire country lived with. America in 1944 had sent its strength overseas. Entire towns were missing their sons. More than 400,000 American servicemen were already dead or missing in action. In places like Brazos County, only women, teenagers, and old men remained to keep the farms alive. Tractors sat idle for lack of drivers. Wheat ripened with no hands to harvest it. Desperation had forced the government to authorize POW labor. Many locals resented it. Some felt insulted that the enemy, the men responsible for the death of their husbands and sons, would now work their fields. Others worried the prisoners would escape, sabotage equipment, start fires, take revenge. Those fears were not whispered. They were spoken openly. Can we trust them? Do they still carry knives? What if they break into homes? What if they come back at night? Emily had heard it all. She had asked the same questions herself. So now, watching the prisoners move cautiously across the yard, she stood stiffly, arms wrapped around her body as if bracing for an unseen blow. The fear was primal, involuntary, woven through grief and memory. She didn't see frail, exhausted men. She saw the uniforms. She saw her husband's coffin flag. She saw the telegram she still kept folded in her nightstand drawer. A gust of wind blew ash from the ruins of the barn, scattering black flakes across the ground. Oscar watched them drift like burned snow, landing on his boots. And something inside him knotted tighter. He recognized the widow's expression. He had seen it on French villagers when German troops marched through their towns. He had seen it in Italy when civilians hid behind doorways. The fear of the invader, the fear of the man in the wrong uniform. Now he was the invader, and she was the one left behind. Oscar's pulse quickened. He felt the old dread crawl up his spine, the dread from the propaganda films, from the whispered stories, from the ship crossing. What if the kindness so far had been a trick? What if this assignment, here in the shadow of a burned barn, was the moment the mask slipped? He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the ground. "Do not anger them," he whispered to the man beside him. "Do not speak unless spoken to." Yet, even as he said it, he sensed that the widow was just as frightened as he was. Her steps were small, careful. She kept her distance. Her eyes darted between the prisoners and the guard's rifle. Fear met fear. Grief met guilt. Two broken sides studied each other from behind invisible barriers. Across the yard, Hayes shifted nervously. "You men behave," he warned, though his voice cracked slightly. "Lady's been through hell." Oscar didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. All the men did. They nodded, stiff, compliant. Silence thickened. Ash fell. Texas heat pressed down like a hand on their backs. In that shared stillness, widow, guard, prisoners, all imprisoned by their own fears, none of them could imagine what the next 24 hours would bring. They only knew one thing with certainty. This could go terribly wrong, or impossibly right, and none of them were ready for either. The first act of kindness came quietly, almost accidentally, like a shift in the wind that no one noticed until it was already upon them. After the guards assigned the prisoners to clear the barn's ruins, Emily stepped back toward the porch, intending to keep her distance. She still didn't trust them. She didn't trust herself either, not to look at their uniforms and feel her chest tighten, not to hear their accents and think of the telegram folded in her dresser. She told herself she would watch from afar. She would keep an eye on them in case they tried to slip away or light another fire or do anything. Anything at all. But something unexpected happened. The prisoners began to work, not sluggishly, not resentfully, not with the defeated air she associated with captured enemies. They moved with purpose, as if rebuilding this American barn was work they had prepared for all their lives. One lifted charred beams with surprising strength. Another sorted nails into neat piles, separating the bent from the straight. Oscar knelt in the ashes, brushing debris aside with bare hands, uncovering boards that could still be salvaged. It was the first time Emily realized they weren't looking around for opportunities to escape. They were looking for opportunities to help. Still, she watched warily, arms wrapped around her ribs. A few hours into the work, the Texas sun grew brutal, pressing down like the weight of an anvil. Hayes, the young guard, walked over to the group and pulled a water jug from his canteen bag. He hesitated. Regulations discouraged unnecessary contact, but then he unscrewed the cap and handed the jug to the closest prisoner. The man froze, confused. Hayes frowned. "Go on, drink." The German looked around, unsure if this was a test. Then he took a hesitant sip, followed by a longer one. Water dripped from his chin. He wiped his mouth with trembling fingers and whispered, "Danke." Hayes nodded. "You're welcome." Emily couldn't stop staring. No one had shouted. No one had threatened. A simple kindness had passed between guard and prisoner like a small, fragile miracle, and it wasn't an isolated moment. Over the next hours, Emily saw more. When the wind kicked up dust, Hayes offered the prisoners bandanas to tie around their faces. When one man cut his thumb on a nail, the guard called for the first aid kit without hesitation. When Oscar tried to move a beam too heavy for him alone, 2 other prisoners stepped forward, not because they were ordered to, but because cooperation seemed instinctive to them. Emily's fear didn't vanish, but it loosened, like a knot coming undone. Around noon, another sound reached the yard, a convoy rattling down the road. 3 trucks of POW laborers passed by on their way to a different farm. They were singing, not military songs, not the harsh rhythms of marching. They sang a folk song, soft, melodic, foreign yet strangely comforting. The Texan ranchers driving the trucks let them continue, even tapping the steering wheel in rhythm as they passed. Emily blinked. The prisoners looked almost normal. The day's work paused briefly when the army sent rations to the Turner farm. The guard in charge opened the crates, pulling out loaves of bread, tins of butter, and a large metal pot of coffee that steamed in the afternoon heat. He set it on a table beneath the shade of a pecan tree. "Break time," Hayes called. The prisoners lined up silently, their movements careful, almost reverent. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air, a smell so ordinary in America, yet so miraculous to men who had eaten ersatz loaves of sawdust flour and potato peelings for years. When the first German reached the table, he looked down at the bread as though it were gold. His hand hovered above it, hesitant. Hayes frowned. "Take it." The prisoner swallowed. "For us?" "For you," the guard confirmed. The man's throat worked. His hand shook as he broke off a piece, brought it to his mouth, and closed his eyes. He chewed as if rediscovering something sacred. Emily felt something twist inside her. That same man had probably marched through villages half-starved. That same man had likely believed until this moment that Americans would feed him scraps if they fed him at all. But here he was, eating better than most civilians in Germany. A truth not lost on any of them. Oscar reached the table next. Hayes handed him a tin cup and filled it with coffee. Steam curled from the surface, rising like a ghost in the hot air. Oscar murmured, "Kaffee, richtige Kaffee." Real coffee. He lifted the cup with both hands as if afraid it might slip away. Emily watched his fingers shake. When he took the first sip, a sound escaped him, half sigh, half sob. "Why?" Oscar asked softly, eyes still lowered. "Why you give this?" Hayes shrugged, unsure how to explain something that felt embedded in the very bones of his country. "Because you're working. Because you're human. Because it's the right thing to do." Emily froze. Those words, "the right thing to do," landed with unexpected force. That was how Matthew had lived. That was how his father had lived. That was how Texans raised their sons, to treat people decently, even people who wore the wrong uniform, even people who had once been the enemy. America had chosen mercy, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And that realization hit the prisoners just as deeply as it hit her. As the break ended, the Germans returned to work with renewed energy. But now, something had changed in the air. The fear that had gripped both sides that morning had softened, like a fabric washed clean. Emily ventured a little closer. She didn't speak to them, not yet, but she watched as one prisoner carefully brushed soot from a surviving beam, treating it like something precious. She watched Oscar measure burned posts with the precision of a carpenter. She watched a young prisoner, barely more than a teenager, hum quietly as he sifted through debris. They were enemies, but they were also boys, farmers, carpenters, sons, just like hers. 2 days later, kindness appeared again, this time in a way that nearly overwhelmed the prisoners entirely. The ranchers nearby, hearing about the fire, invited Emily and her work detail for a barbecue lunch at the Johnson place. It was a custom in Texas. When someone faced hardship, the neighbors gathered. Loss was never born alone. Emily hesitated. Bringing German prisoners into someone else's yard felt impossible. But the rancher insisted. They're working for you, aren't they? Then they're guests. Guests. The word didn't make sense to the prisoners. But that afternoon, as they approached the Johnson ranch, they smelled something that stopped them in their tracks. Mesquite smoke drifting from a pit, carrying the unmistakable scent of slow-cooked beef. Their steps faltered. Some whispered to each other in disbelief. One man muttered, "Nein, unmöglich." Impossible. And yet, the impossible kept happening. The cowboys waved them over as if greeting old friends. The smoking pit was opened, revealing slabs of brisket glistening with juice. The rancher's wife brought out homemade rolls and peach cobbler. A little barefoot girl skipped around the yard, giggling as she peeked at the Germans from behind her mother's skirt. One by one, the POWs accepted plates. Some stared at the food too long, unsure if it was real. One man cried silently into his hands before he could take a bite. Oscar sat stiffly on a bench, staring down at the feast in front of him, the kind of meal he had not seen since before the war. Emily found herself sitting nearby. She hadn't planned to, but the scene was so surreal, so gently miraculous, she couldn't look away. One German finally broke the silence. "Why?" he asked aloud, looking from face to face. "Why you do this? Feed us. Treat us like we are men, not enemy." The cowboy who had served him shrugged. "War's over for y'all," he said simply, "but here in Texas, we still got manners." Emily felt tears rise unexpectedly. She looked at the soldiers, Texans, farm boys, men raised during the Great Depression but taught never to withhold kindness, and something in her chest warmed painfully. This was the America Matthew had believed in. This was the America he had died for. This was the America she feared had disappeared when he did, but it was still here, alive, radiant in its decency. Later that evening, as the POWs climbed into the transport truck to return to her farm, Oscar paused on the step. He glanced at Emily, then spoke with quiet sincerity. "Today was first day. I not feel like prisoner." Emily nodded, unable to speak, and for the first time since Matthew died, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. The morning after the barbecue, the Turner farm felt different. Not repaired, not healed, but changed in some quiet, perceptible way. The fear that had once hung in the air like humidity had thinned, as if kindness had burned it off the way the Texas sun burned mist off the fields. The prisoners sensed it first. They arrived with the same caution as before. Eyes lowered, steps measured, spines straight. But now their movements were quicker, more purposeful. For the first time, they weren't walking as men awaiting judgment or remembering propaganda. They walked as laborers with a job to do. And though none of them said it aloud, each felt a small ember of pride glowing warm in his chest. The barn mattered, to the widow, to the farm, and strangely, to them. The burned foundation was cool enough to approach now. Charred posts jutted upward like broken ribs, and piles of blackened lumber lay scattered across the ground. Smoke no longer rose, but the smell lingered, a heavy, sour scent of ash and loss. Oscar moved toward it slowly, taking in the dimensions, the angles, the remains of what had once been. Behind him, two other prisoners whispered measurements in German, quietly debating which pieces might be salvageable. Emily stood on the porch, arms crossed, but she no longer stood at the farthest corner. She watched them, tension in her posture but curiosity in her eyes. The difference was subtle, but real. Around 9, Hayes approached the group. "Command says you boys can start rebuilding the frame," he said. "Nails, hammers, posts, everything's in the truck. You work until sundown." The prisoners nodded, grateful for clear instruction. But then Emily did something none of them expected. She stepped forward. It was only a few steps, but to them it felt like she had crossed miles. She approached Oscar, who looked up at her with visible surprise. She hesitated before speaking, choosing words the way a person chooses whether to touch a flame. "My husband built this barn," she said softly, "with his own hands." Oscar swallowed, then nodded solemnly. "We build it." "Again," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. "For you." Emily opened her mouth to reply, but her voice failed. She simply nodded and stepped back. Yet her presence, her approval, her permission to rebuild, it struck them deeper than the barbecue or the bread or the coffee. This was trust. Given reluctantly, but given all the same. The prisoners began at once. For a time, the yard became a symphony of labor. Wood thudded, hammers rang, saws rasped. Men called to one another in German and accented English. Hayes kept watch, but not rigidly, no longer hovering as if expecting trouble. The work was grueling, but familiar. Many of the POWs came from farms and villages across Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony. Barns were universal. Timber was universal. Sweat was universal. As the day warmed, sweat soaked through their shirts and dripped from their brows. They wiped it away, smearing soot across their cheeks. Their movements grew steady, sure. Oscar seemed to transform before Emily's eyes, no longer a frightened prisoner, but a craftsman, confident and precise. He climbed onto the remaining foundation stone and began directing the reconstruction with the ease of someone who had done this before the war swallowed his life. "Beam here," he said, tapping a corner with his measuring stick. "This one no good," another man said, lifting a charred post and tossing it aside. "Cut at 40 degrees, Oscar instructed, pointing to a saw. "Ja, ja." 40, the youngest prisoner echoed, grabbing tools eagerly. For the first time since the telegram, Emily felt something stirring, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Purpose. Movement. Life returning. Around noon, the prisoners raised the first new support beam, 4 men lifting, 2 guiding, 1 holding the level. The beam slid into place with a heavy, decisive thud. Something about that sound shook Emily's chest. Her breath caught. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she found Hayes watching her. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "I just didn't think I would ever hear that sound again." The guard nodded, understanding more than his age should have allowed. "Ma'am," he said gently, "these men, They ain't what the newspapers say." He paused. "They work hard, harder than I do sometimes." Emily looked back at the prisoners. They were sweaty, dirty, exhausted, and they were rebuilding something that wasn't theirs, something belonging to the enemy. But that wasn't all. They were rebuilding her husband's legacy. For them, the work was something else entirely. Each stroke of the hammer felt like chiseling away a layer of propaganda. Each beam hoisted into place felt like reclaiming a piece of the humanity the war had stripped from them. The Germans had been raised on ideology, on the belief that strength was cruelty, that weakness was empathy, that mercy was defeat. But here, on an American farm, under an American sun, they saw an entirely different kind of strength, a strength that fed its prisoners, a strength that trusted its enemies with tools and timber, a strength that chose humanity even in the midst of global conflict. Oscar felt it most acutely. "This country," he murmured in German as he hammered nails into a new crossbeam, "this country is different." His companion, Carl, nodded. "Too different. Maybe that is why they win." By late afternoon, the skeleton of the new barn stood proudly over the foundation. Not complete, far from it, but unmistakably alive. A structure. A shape. A promise. When the men stepped back to admire their progress, dusty and bruised but proud, Emily walked forward again, this time with far less hesitation. "You did this in one day," she said softly, awe and gratitude tangled in her voice. Oscar wiped sweat from his brow. "We not finish," he said. "Tomorrow, we make roof." Emily's eyes softened. "Tomorrow," she repeated. It was the first time she had spoken to him without tension. Even the other prisoners noticed. Carl whispered, "She trusts us now." And Oscar nodded, though he barely believed it. As the sun dipped low and the heat began to loosen its grip, something remarkable happened. Emily brought out a pitcher of lemonade. She didn't hand it to the guard to distribute, she didn't set it on the ground, she carried it herself, stepping toward the group of exhausted men. The prisoners froze as she approached, unsure what to do. She held out the pitcher. "You've worked hard," she said. "Please." For a moment, no one moved. Then Oscar stepped forward, hands trembling slightly, and accepted the pitcher. He poured it into his tin cup, took a sip, and nearly gasped. The sweetness, the coldness, it was a luxury beyond imagining. He looked at Emily, eyes shining with disbelief. "Danke," he whispered. And Emily, for the first time, smiled. A real smile. The smallest crack opened in a wall built of fear and grief and war. Behind them, the frame of the barn stood tall against the glowing Texas sky. A monument not only to the man who had built it once, but to the enemies who were now building it again. America's agricultural might have been unmatched in 1944. Its factories unmatched. Its strength unmatched. But on this farm, in this moment, something else defined the country even more clearly. Its humanity, its moral courage, its unshakable belief that dignity was not a reward, but a birthright, even for enemies. And as the POWs climbed back onto the transport truck that evening, exhausted but fulfilled, Emily found herself whispering something she had never expected to say about the men who wore the uniform that had taken her husband. "They're not what I thought." The truck rumbled away, leaving the barn's rising frame silhouetted by the fading sun. Tomorrow they would make the roof. But today something far more important had been rebuilt. Trust, and the first fragile threads of forgiveness. By the fourth day, the barn's frame was nearly complete. The roof beams were set, the foundation was cleared, and the skeleton of the structure rose like a rebuke to the fire that had destroyed it, and to the war that had shattered all their lives. The POWs worked in steady rhythm, sunburned and sweat-streaked, their denim uniforms clinging to their backs. They moved with purpose, not commanded, with energy, not forced. But no one was prepared for what happened next. It began in the late afternoon, when the sky dimmed to a soft amber and the heat of the day finally loosened its grip. Emily had brought out a basket of cornbread and a fresh pitcher of sweet tea, something she told herself she did only because they were working so hard, though part of her knew the truth was more complicated. The men paused to rest under the pecan tree. The wind carried the scent of sawdust, sweat, and warm earth. Hayes stood nearby, leaning casually on his rifle but no longer clutching it with tension. Oscar sat apart from the others, staring at the barn frame with a look Emily had never seen before, something like awe, or grief, or both. She brought him a piece of cornbread. "Here," she said gently. He looked up, startled. His eyes, blue and clouded with exhaustion, met hers for only a second before he lowered them again. He reached for the bread, but his hand trembled so violently the piece nearly slipped from his grasp. Emily frowned. "Are you all right?" Oscar nodded too quickly. "Ja. Yes." He took a bite, and then it happened. The moment the cornbread touched his tongue, something inside him broke. His shoulders shook first, small, barely noticeable tremors. Then his breath hitched, sharp and uneven. Emily thought at first he was choking, but then he covered his face with both hands, elbows pressing into his knees, and a sound escaped him. A sound she had never heard from a grown man. He was crying, violently, uncontrollably. As if years of silence had suddenly given way. The other prisoners froze. Hayes straightened, unsure if he should intervene. Emily knelt instinctively beside Oscar. "Oscar," she whispered, "what's wrong?" He shook his head helplessly, words tangled behind his tears. When he finally spoke, his voice came out small and broken. "I have not eaten real bread. In 3 years." Emily stared at him, stunned. "I forgot. The taste," he whispered. "In Africa. In Italy. We ate stones. Dirt. Soup made of nothing. I forget what bread is." He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. "And now, you give me this." He looked at the cornbread again as though it were an object of unbearable meaning. "And I cannot understand why." Emily felt her throat tighten. She had feared these men, hated the uniform they wore, but now, watching this young soldier collapse under the weight of a simple kindness, she saw not a German, not an enemy, but a boy, a hungry, broken boy far from home. Her voice softened. "You're safe now." She didn't know why she said it, but she meant it. At those words, something shattered deeper inside him. He sobbed harder, leaning forward until his forehead nearly touched the ground. Carl, the older prisoner, approached quietly. His voice trembled as he placed a hand on Oscar's back. "It's all right," he murmured in German. "Let it out, Junge. We all feel it." Emily stood, not wanting to intrude on the intimate grief. But Carl caught her eye, and what she saw in his expression made her breath falter. Gratitude. Raw, vulnerable gratitude. He nodded once, a small, solemn acknowledgement of what her words had done. Behind her, Hayes let out a long exhale. "Lord Almighty," he muttered under his breath. "They're just kids." He wasn't talking to her. He wasn't talking to the prisoners. He was talking to himself, to the version of himself that had arrived here expecting monsters. Across the yard, another prisoner, Johann, lifted his shirt to wipe sweat from his face, revealing a rib cage far too prominent for a man his age. A scar ran across his side, and when the breeze hit him, he winced. Emily stared. These were not the soldiers she had imagined from newspaper headlines or wartime posters. These were not the propaganda monsters of American imagination. They were thin, sunburned, fearful. They looked like farm boys, the kind who might have danced at county fairs or fixed tractors with their fathers. The realization hit her so suddenly she nearly staggered. Matthew could have been one of them, one of these boys, far from home, hungry, terrified, trying to survive a war none of them had chosen. The thought broke something open inside her. She reached out and touched Oscar's shoulder, lightly, hesitantly, but enough for him to lift his head. His face was streaked with tears, dust, and sweat. His eyes were impossibly young. "In Germany," he said softly, voice hoarse, "the mothers bring boys like me bread. Warm bread. Before war." He swallowed. "I remember my mother's hands. She give me bread before I go to school." His face crumpled. "I have not thought of her in so long." Emily felt tears on her own cheeks before she realized she was crying too. The two of them, widow and prisoner, enemy and enemy, were suddenly bound by something deeper than grief. They were bound by memory, by loss, by the fragile, universal desire for home. Carl stepped forward. He stood tall, but his jaw tightened with emotion. "Ma'am," he said in fractured English, "you treat us better than our own army treat us." Emily shook her head. "It's not about treating you better. It's about treating you right." Hayes looked at her sharply. She didn't mean to speak those words, but once spoken, they felt true. Carl nodded slowly. "America," he whispered, searching for the right words. "America is strong, because America is good." Oscar nodded, tears still slipping down his face. This country. No hate. Not like ours. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. No hate. The idea struck her with painful force. She had been filled with hate. She had carried it like a stone in her chest. She had believed she had the right to it. But now, watching these men, these frightened, grieving men, she realized something she had never let herself admit. Hatred kept her tied to the grave. Kindness was pulling her back to the living. In the quiet that followed, the Red Cross truck arrived on the road, making its weekly rounds. The medic stepped out, clipboard in hand, calling the prisoners forward for checkups. He handed them vitamins, bandages, and salve for burns. One prisoner stared at the small tin of ointment in disbelief. "For us?" he asked. "For you," the medic confirmed, "just as it was written in the Red Cross reports. Just as it was taught in the U.S. Army manuals. Just as America insisted, even in war." Dignity was non-negotiable, and that was the moment Emily understood the full moral weight of what her country had done. America had fed its prisoners while its own families rationed sugar and meat. America had given medical care to men who had marched beneath swastikas. America had held the moral high ground not out of weakness, but out of strength. The prisoners understood it, too. As the checkups ended, Oscar approached Emily once more. He bowed his head, not militarily, not formally, but humbly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for bread, for words, for seeing us." Emily wiped her eyes. "I didn't see you before," she admitted, "but I do now." Behind them, the barn's new beams cast long shadows across the ground, shadows stretching forward, not backward. Two enemies had cried today. Two enemies had recognized each other's humanity. Two enemies had taken the first step toward forgiveness. And in that fragile, trembling moment, they were enemies no longer. By the time the final nails were driven into the rafters, the barn stood taller than any of them expected, a clean, sturdy silhouette against the endless Texas horizon. But the true rebuilding had been happening long before the last board was set into place. It had begun in moments so small they were almost invisible. A piece of bread shared, a word spoken gently, a fear dissolved by simple decency. For Oscar Mueller, the awakening arrived slowly, like daylight creeping through a shuttered window. Every day on the Turner farm widened the crack a little more. It happened in the way the American guards treated them, not as animals, not as criminals, but as men. It happened when Hayes offered him a canteen on a scorching afternoon and said, "Drink first. You look worse than I do." It happened when the ranchers invited them to Sunday dinner and handed them plates so full they didn't know what to do with them. It happened when Emily Turner, the widow of an American soldier killed fighting Germans, looked him in the eye without hate. A new truth forced itself into his mind. Uncomfortable, disorienting, undeniable. Everything they told us in Germany was wrong. He had expected brutality. What he found was fairness. He had expected humiliation. What he found was dignity. He had expected to be treated like an enemy. What he found was humanity. One afternoon, Oscar stood at the entrance of the newly rebuilt barn, running his fingertips over the fresh beams. The wood was smooth, still smelling of sap and sunlight. Behind him, the other prisoners cleaned the last of the tools, stacking lumber neatly the way Oscar had shown them. Carl approached him quietly. "You are thinking again." Oscar didn't answer at first. He stared at the barn, at the Texas sky beyond it, at the sunlight pooling across the dirt. Then he spoke. "This country." He paused, searching for words. "It is strong. Not because of guns, not because of machines, but because it is good." Carl nodded slowly. "Yeah, they defeated us with kindness." Oscar let out a shaky breath. "I thought I knew my enemies, but I did not know them at all." His voice broke at the end. Carl placed a hand on his shoulder, understanding without needing explanations. Behind them, Hayes approached with a clipboard. He wasn't smiling. He rarely smiled, but the tension that once lived in his shoulders had vanished. He looked at the men with the tired ease of someone who had worked beside them long enough to see them clearly. "You boys did good work," he said. "Better than most folks I know around here." The comment should have been casual. It wasn't. To the prisoners, praise from an American guard meant more than they could describe. Oscar lowered his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Hayes scratched his chin. "I'll tell the colonel this barn's better built than the last one. You fellas did it right." Carl raised his eyebrows in mock pride. "We are German," he said, tapping his chest. "We do not build crooked." Hayes laughed out loud, unexpected and genuine. And something inside Oscar warmed at the sound. That night, back at the camp, the prisoners sat in the dimly lit barracks speaking in low voices. The guards allowed them a small battery-powered radio for news, U.S. news only, carefully monitored. It crackled with reports from France, Italy, the Pacific. Words they didn't fully understand, delivered in accents they couldn't always follow, but they understood enough. America was winning. The world was changing, and they were here, safe, fed, alive, because the enemy had shown mercy. The conversation drifted, settling into something more personal. Johann, the youngest prisoner, hugged his knees to his chest and whispered, "I want to be a teacher. When I go home, if home still exists." Carl nodded. "I will be a nurse. I cannot fight anymore." Another man murmured, "I will carve wood. Like my father, I will make toys." The war had taken so much from them. Country, family, dignity, but somehow in this strange country, they had begun to imagine a life after it. The idea was terrifying. The idea was beautiful. And then Oscar spoke, surprising even himself. "I will tell everyone what America did," he said. His voice trembled, but his resolve did not. Not the soldiers, not the bombs, but the kindness, how they fed us, how they treated us, how they gave us back ourselves. The barracks fell silent. Carl whispered, "You think they will believe you?" Oscar shook his head. "No, but I will tell them anyway." The prisoners didn't sleep much that night. They lay awake in their bunks, listening to the hum of insects outside the walls, each lost in his own thoughts. It was strange, Oscar realized, how silence in America felt different than silence in Europe. There was no fear under it, no dread, only space, empty and quiet, like a field waiting for seeds. The next morning, as they arrived at the Turner farm for the final day of work, Emily stood waiting by the gate. She held something in her hands, a small wooden box wrapped in cloth. As the prisoners approached, she stepped toward Oscar. "I want you to have this," she said. He blinked. "For me." She nodded and placed the box in his hands. Inside was a small carved figure of a horse, simple, handcrafted, its surface polished smooth by time. "My husband carved that," she said softly. "He made it when he was a boy. I think he would want you to have it." Oscar stared at the figure, unable to speak. His throat closed. His eyes stung. This wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was the beginning. Emily's voice softened further. He believed people were worth helping, even strangers, even people far from home. Oscar swallowed hard. "I will keep it safe." "I know," she said. Hayes watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. But as Emily stepped back, Hayes approached Oscar with a solemn look. "You did right by her," he said. "You boys all did." Oscar nodded, still unable to find words. Hayes hesitated, then added, "And for what it's worth, I misjudged you." The words struck Oscar like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they healed. By sunset, the barn was finished. Its roof glowed gold under the dying light. Emily stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, tears on her cheeks. Not tears of grief this time, but something gentler, something like peace. The prisoners lined up to leave, climbing onto the truck. Before it started, Emily stepped forward once more. She raised her hand to them. Not a wave, not a farewell, something deeper. A gesture of gratitude between people who had saved one another in different ways. "Thank you," she said, voice steady. "For giving me something back." Carl nodded. Johann smiled. Oscar pressed the carved horse to his chest. As the truck rumbled away, dust curling in its wake, Oscar looked back at the Turner farm one last time. The barn stood proud and strong, and beyond it he saw Emily, a small figure in a wide world, watching them go. And in that moment, Oscar understood the truth fully, unshakably. America had defeated him. Not with bullets, but with decency. It was a victory more powerful than any battlefield. And long after the war ended, long after the fences came down, long after he returned to a broken homeland in need of rebuilding, Oscar would tell anyone who listened, "They treated us like men. America won the war with mercy." In the spring of 1946, when the war was finally over, and the paperwork of repatriation began to churn through military offices across the United States, the German prisoners at Camp Hearn received their orders. One by one, names were read aloud. One by one, men packed the few possessions they had accumulated. Letters from American families, small carvings, camp script souvenirs, worn copies of English books. When Oscar Miller heard his name, he felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. He would go home, but he would leave something behind. The morning the transport trucks arrived, Emily Turner was already waiting at the gate. She didn't fully understand why she had come. No one expected a widow to say goodbye to men who once wore the uniform of her husband's enemy. But as she stood beneath the rising Texas sun, watching the prisoners line up with their duffel bags slung over their shoulders, she knew there was no choice at all. Something in her life had changed, and these men had been part of that change. When Oscar reached her, he stopped. He held out the carved wooden horse she had given him, wrapped carefully in a cloth. "For you," he said softly, "to say thank you." She shook her head. "No, it's yours." Oscar hesitated. Then, "Let me give you this." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small folded paper. When she opened it, she found a sketch, charcoal lines capturing the new barn, the roof strong, the beams straight, the fields stretching behind it like the pages of a story waiting to be written. At the bottom, he had written, in careful English, "For Matthew, built with respect." Emily couldn't speak. She simply reached forward and placed her hand over his. "Safe travels, Oscar." He bowed his head. "Goodbye, Mrs. Turner." The truck rumbled to life and the prisoners climbed aboard. Dust billowed. The engines roared. As the convoy rolled down the dirt road, Emily kept watching until the last trace of movement disappeared into the horizon. She stood alone at the gate for a long time, remembering the fear, the anger, the grief that had haunted her, remembering how the barn had risen again, not only from wood and nails but from unexpected acts of mercy, remembering that her husband had believed in an America defined by dignity, not vengeance. And for the first time since his death, she felt him close. The voyage back to Germany was colder, quieter, and far more uncertain than the journey that had brought them to America. The men crowded along the rails, staring at the endless water, each man wondering what waited on the other side. Ruin, hunger, homes collapsed, families missing, a future no one could predict. But there was something else they carried across the Atlantic, something no army, no regime, no propaganda had prepared them for: kindness. Carl repeated it aloud one night on the ship's deck, his voice rough from the wind. "When I tell them," he said, "they will not believe me." Oscar nodded. "Tell them anyway." And they did. When the ship reached Bremerhaven, villagers gathered on the docks to greet the returning prisoners. Mothers cried. Children clung to uniforms that didn't fit anymore. Red Cross officers shouted orders. The world felt small again, gray, broken, familiar. But when families asked how America had treated them, the first truth spilled out in disbelief. They fed us, then another. They healed us, and another. They let us work. They paid us. They treated us like men. Neighbors shook their heads. Some accused the POWs of lying. Some insisted it was American propaganda. Some refused to accept that the country that had bombed their cities could also have shown mercy. But others listened, and among them were the next generation, the children and grandchildren who would grow up hearing stories of a faraway land where even wartime enemies slept on clean beds and ate meat and bread and drank coffee they had forgotten existed. Stories of America. Stories of dignity. Stories of a nation strong enough to be gentle. Between 1946 and 1955, something remarkable happened. Thousands of former German POWs applied to return to the United States, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. Some came to Texas to work on the very ranches where they once labored behind wire fences. Some married American women they had met during their captivity. Some settled in the Midwest, becoming carpenters, farmers, auto workers. They told immigration officials the same reason again and again. America was the first place I ever felt human. Historians later wrote about it with amazement. Red Cross observers cited it in their reports. U.S. Army officials quietly acknowledged it. America had become a place where even the defeated found dignity. A land not of perfection, but of moral courage. The greatest generation didn't just win a war, they won something deeper. They won the world's respect. And yet, as years passed and the world changed, those stories took on another meaning, one that stung with truth. America during World War II had been many things: united, purposeful, moral, industrial, willing to sacrifice for the common good. Today, the contrasts were sharper. Where there had once been unity, now there was division. Where there had been shared purpose, now there was constant conflict. Where community had been instinctive, now loneliness spread in its place. Where dignity had been offered even to enemies, now public life was marked by cruelty that once belonged only to wartime propaganda. And so these POW stories, simple, human, unpolished, became more than history. They became mirrors that showed America not just what it had been, but what it could be again. Years later, long after Oscar had built a life in Germany, he wrote a letter to Emily Turner. His handwriting was slow, careful, shaped by memories that had never faded. He wrote, "America did not just win the war with steel. America won it with mercy. Your country fed us, healed us, and reminded us what humanity looked like. That is the country I will never forget." Emily kept the letter in the same drawer as the folded telegram. 2 pieces of paper, 2 wars, 2 truths. One spoke of sacrifice, the other spoke of redemption. Both testify to the soul of a nation, and that legacy lived on, not only in history books, but in families across 2 continents. Children of POWs grew up hearing their fathers say, "The Americans saved me." Grandchildren visited the camps where their ancestors once lived and wrote messages online. "Thank you, America. Your kindness changed our family's history." And Americans, reading those words, felt something tighten in their chests. A mix of pride, sorrow, longing. Pride for what their forefathers had done, sorrow for the distance between that America and today's. Longing for a time when strength and goodness walked hand in hand. Because in the end, the story of Oscar and the Turner farm was not a story about war or even about forgiveness. It was a story about character, about a nation that chose dignity over vengeance, about a widow who found healing through unexpected compassion, about an enemy soldier who discovered his humanity again on foreign soil, and above all, it was a reminder of the America that once was, a reminder of the America people still hope for, a reminder of the America that won hearts not by force but by kindness. And the truth remains, echoing across decades, across families, across oceans. America did not teach them English. America taught them dignity,